Good evening, everyone, to the Council meeting, the date 26th of July 2021. I'll call upon Councillor Addis to read the Council prayer. Councillor Addis.
Thank you. Almighty God, we humbly seek your blessings upon this Council. Direct and prosper its deliberations to the advancement of your glory and the true welfare of the people of the City of Boroondara. Amen.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. I'll now call upon Councillor Watson to read the Acknowledgement of Country. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people as the traditional owners and original custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be here today.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. The health, safety and wellbeing of the community has and always will be a paramount consideration of Council. Council continues to be guided by government directives and wants to be able to do the right thing for the health of our community during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Local Government Act enables Council to hold virtual meetings and councillors can participate in meetings remotely by electronic means of communication. The Council meeting is being live streamed on the Council website, so you'll be able to view the proceedings of the meeting, councillor deliberations and voting. Should technical problems be encountered this evening, the meeting will be adjourned until resolved or otherwise postponed. I'll start by introducing my fellow councillors and officers who are here with me this evening, and if I can just ask councillors to raise their hand as I call your name. Councillor Jim Park, Councillor Felicity Sinfield, Councillor Victor Franco, Councillor Wes Galt, Councillor Di Gillies, Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, so Councillor Hollingsworth will be joining us shortly, Councillor Jane Addis,
there's your camera.
Councillor Cynthia Watson, the Deputy Mayor, Councillor Susan Bigger, and last but not least, Councillor Nick Stavery. We also have a number of other officers in attendance this evening. Our CEO, Mr Philip Storer, Carolyn McLean, Director of Community Support, Mr Daniel Freer, Director of Places and Spaces, Mr Bruce Dobson, Director of Customer and Transformation, Mr Nick Lund, Acting Director of Urban Living, Mr David Thompson, Manager of Governance and Legal, Ms Elizabeth Manu, Senior Governance Officer. There'll also be a number of other officers who will be in attendance this evening and they'll be introduced as they present their reports. I'll now move to the order of business as listed in our business papers. Mr Thompson, are there any apologies this evening?
Through you, Mr Mayor, there are no apologies for this evening.
Thank you, Mr Thompson. We'll move on to item 1, adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the Council meeting held on the 28th of June 2021. I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Park.
So moved, Mr Mayor.
And seconder, was that you, Councillor Galt?
It was. Thank you.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Park, is there any opposition? There appears to be none. I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? That is all, councillors. Thank you, councillors, and welcome, Councillor Hollingsworth. You can see you on the screen now. We'll move on to item 2, declaration of conflict of interest of any council or council officer. Are there any conflicts of interest this evening? There appears to be none. Thank you. Item 3, 3.1 petitions. Mr Thompson, are there any petitions this evening?
Thank you, and through you, Mr Mayor. Councillors, since you met last month, councillors received 4 petitions. The details of the petitions are set out in the business papers before you this evening. It would be remiss of me not to draw your attention particularly to petition 2. Okay. The reason why I'm drawing your attention to petition 2 is Civic Services have taken the lead on this particular matter, and therefore it's appropriate to refer this petition to the Director of Urban Living to action rather than the Director of Places and Spaces. So with that, minor change, I commend the officer's recommendation to you as set out in your business papers.
Thank you, Mr Thompson. Councillors, acknowledging the change that Mr Thompson has indicated, is anyone prepared to move a motion? I see Councillor Park and seconded Councillor Bigger.
Happy to move the officer's amended recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Park, and happy to second that, Councillor Bigger.
Happy to second.
That's why, councillors, I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously, councillors. I'm just looking for Councillor Hollingsworth. I couldn't see her vote. I recognise Councillor Hollingsworth has not been able to vote on that because I can't see her vote. We'll move on to the next item of business this evening. Item 4, informal meetings of councillors. Up on the screen and in our business papers are the meetings of councillors that have been distributed with our meeting papers. Councillors, I'm in search. If I can actually, if we can just drop that off the screen so I can see all councillors. Thanks. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion to note and receive Councillor Addis.
Happy to move that as printed.
And seconded Councillor Gillies. I think your hand just came straight up then. Is there any dissension from this motion? There appears to be none. I will put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried. And I'm looking for Councillor Hollingsworth. Sorry, we've got a little issue, technical issue with Councillor Hollingsworth. So those have all voted in favour, absent Councillor Hollingsworth. We'll move to item 5, public question time. Council encourages the submission of public questions prior to 12 p.m. on the day of the meeting. Questions submitted prior to 12 noon will be provided with a detailed verbal response as well as a response in writing. Those submitted after 12 will receive a verbal response if possible, but otherwise will be taken on notice for a written response to be provided in due course. Mr Thompson, do we have any public questions?
Through you, Mr Mayor, we've received one question with notice and no questions without notice.
Thank you, Mr Thompson. The one question was received prior to 12 noon today. A copy of that question has been circulated to all councillors. The question will also be referred to the relevant council officer to provide a written response in due course. The question was received from Mr Ian Hundley of Boroondara North. The question has been disallowed in accordance with clause 54.2.2 of the governance rules, which provides that no person may submit more than 11 questions in any one calendar year. Mr Hundley has already submitted 11 questions which have been responded to at council meetings in this calendar year. Councillors have received a copy of the question from Mr Hundley, and Mr Hundley, you will receive a written response from our Director of Places and Spaces in due course. Thank you. Move on to item 6. Mr Thompson, do we have any notices of motion?
Through you, Mr Mayor, there are no notices of motion for consideration this evening.
Thank you, Mr Thompson. We'll move on to item 7. Now, councillors, item 7.1, 7.2, 7.3 and 7.4. Do any councillors have issues or concerns with respect to the order of the agenda and may wish to flag any items for discussion or items which may not have been discussed and therefore can be moved on block 7.1 through 4 inclusive? If there are any questions on those or if councillors aren't in support of those recommendations, there appears to be none. So, Councillor Park,
I'm happy to move items 7.1 through to 7.4, both inclusive on block. Chair, in the event that Councillor Hollingsworth still isn't in view, might I suggest that we could perhaps pause for a moment, given that she is in the building. I imagine she could be retrieved without too much difficulty.
So I think we will, Councillor Park, I think I'll seek an adjournment after we've moved this motion if there's a willingness of councillors just to move this item. So Councillor Stavrou, you're happy to second the en bloc motion?
Happy to second it, Mr. Mayor.
Is there any opposition to the en bloc motion this evening? There appears to be none. I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried with the exception of Councillor Hollingsworth. Councillors, I'm just going to search for a short motion of adjournment motion. Councillor Park?
So moved.
And seconded Councillor Sinfield.
Absolutely.
I recommend we adjourn for 5 minutes to see if we can retrieve Councillor Hollingsworth. I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried. Thank you, councillors. Thank you, councillors. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion to resume our meeting. Councillor Sinfield?
Happy to move that.
And seconded Councillor Stavrou. I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. And for the gallery, you'll notice that Councillor Hollingsworth has joined Councillor Sinfield. We'll move on to item 7.5 of the agenda, progress report on the development of the Boroondara reconciliation strategy. This will be introduced by Ms Nicole White, Manager of Community Planning and Development.
Thank you. Good evening. At the Council meeting on Monday, the 26th of April, Council resolved a draft Boroondara reconciliation strategy be presented to Council in late 2021 for consideration. The strategy will provide Council with a vision for reconciliation in the municipality and set out a clear roadmap and framework for implementing reconciliation initiatives in the community. Council also resolved at the meeting that an interim report be presented to Council in July, providing a progress update on consultation, a proposed governance structure, and a recommendation for an outcome to the petition presented at the Council meeting on the 22nd of February, requesting Council to raise and permanently fly the Aboriginal flag. To develop the strategy, Council has engaged a consultant who is respected in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to assist with facilitating the community consultation. They've provided feedback and advice on the consultation and are facilitating individual and focus group sessions with key Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stakeholders. In addition, Council has also developed an online survey seeking to understand the community's vision for reconciliation in Boroondara. Consultation with local health and wellbeing services, schools, community organisations and groups is also being undertaken in July and August. The Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation is also being consulted closely and at regular intervals to inform the strategy. The findings of the community consultation and feedback from our local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stakeholders and community will inform the development of the draft strategy, which will be presented to Council for public exhibition in late 2021. The report also recommends an internal Boroondara Reconciliation Advisory Committee to oversee the implementation of the strategy. The committee is not a decision-making board, but will be responsible for monitoring the progress of Council's internal actions and provide advice. It will consist of Council officers and councillors. To ensure councillors continuing to seek expert advice, guidance and feedback from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, a number of opportunities have been considered. Officers will continue to meet regularly with the Wurundjeri. Currently, this is on a monthly basis. The internal committee will also meet with the Wurundjeri at a minimum twice a year to develop relationships, report back on the implementation of council actions, and to seek feedback on any key issues. The internal committee will also invite the elders to an inaugural meeting to commence consultation with them. The committee will also seek expert advice from external Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations or individuals when necessary for meeting the objectives of the group. In addition to the advisory committee, council officers will also develop a local reconciliation stakeholder group, which would invite representatives from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, networks, and other community groups to identify opportunities to collaborate, share information, increase cultural understanding, strengthen relationships, and deliver actions in the community. The report also notes a recommendation for an outcome to the petition to permanently fly the Aboriginal flag at locations across Boroondara. In line with the federal government's advice, officers recommend the Aboriginal flag should be permanently flown at the Camberwell Civic Centre. This is also in line with the benchmarking against the Eastern Metropolitan Region Councils who permanently fly the Aboriginal flag at their civic centres. Finally, the report notes an update to the Acknowledgement of Country, as the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung are now formally recognised through the Aboriginal Heritage Act 2006 as the traditional owners for all of Boroondara. Tonight, officers recommend that Council resolve to note the progress update on the development of a consultation methodology and engagement plan for the Boroondara Reconciliation Strategy and to improve the recommendations in the report. One recommendation has been revised. It is the first dot point, which I will read out. So officers now recommend the formation of a new advisory committee, being the Boroondara Reconciliation Advisory Committee, to oversee the development, ongoing consultation with Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung elders and implementation of the Boroondara Reconciliation Strategy. Officers will develop and present the terms of reference for the advisory committee at a later council meeting. The members of the Internal Advisory Committee will include up to a maximum of 5 councillors, being Councillor Hollingsworth, Councillor Biggar, Councillor Franco and the Mayor, Councillor Thompson. The terms of reference of the Advisory Committee will be reviewed in 12 months after the inception of the committee to ensure it's operating effectively. The Internal Advisory Committee will invite the elders to an inaugural meeting at the elders' earliest convenience to commence consultation with them regarding the development of the strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms White, for your presentation. Councillors, are there any questions of officers on the interim report? No questions? I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Biggar.
Yeah, I'm happy to propose the officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. And do I have a seconder for that, Councillor Gillies? To assist Councillor Biggar, is there any opposition to this item?
Sorry, Mr Mayor, to interject, just so that councillors are absolutely clear, what Councillor Biggar is moving is the revised officer recommendation.
Councillor Biggar, that is the case, the revised officer's recommendation, and seconded by Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Mr Thompson. Yes, I would like to move the revised officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Biggar. To assist Councillor Biggar, there's no opposition on this item. Councillor Biggar, would you like to speak to your motion this evening?
Yes, briefly. Thank you. First of all, I want to just thank the officers. This has been fantastic work by the officers, and I really appreciate the effort that they put into providing us with this interim progress report. And particularly, I applaud their commitment to building relationships with the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people. It's very important, and I think this is a really exciting progress update, so thank you for that. It's particularly good to see that we're providing a response to the petition brought to Council in February regarding raising and flying of the Aboriginal flag, and I'm fully supportive of the recommendation that starting tomorrow we would raise and permanently fly the Aboriginal flag from the Camberwell Civic Centre. And I certainly want to say that I support the thought and the careful planning that has gone into, I think, this governance structure, the consultation and the engagement with the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people. It continues to be, this will be a really fundamental part of what we do here, I think, is that engagement and that partnership. So I think I would hope that I speak for all councillors when I say that we look forward to the full report later this year, and I'm very happy to move the officer's revised recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Biggar. I'll now put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item 7.6, adoption of the governance rules. This will be introduced by Mr David Thompson, Manager of Governance and Legal.
Thank you, and through you, Mr Mayor. Councillors, you may recall the governance rules were adopted by Council on the 24th of August last year and came into operation on the 1st of September 2020. On the 24th of May 2021, Council resolved to endorse the proposed governance rules for the purposes of public consultation for the period from the 27th of May to the 25th of June 2021. A total of 195 written submissions, including 15 late submissions, were received. Of those, 8 submitters spoke in support of their written submission at the Services Delegated Committee meeting held on the 12th of July 2021. Officers note no new information was introduced from the 8 submitters who presented, which was not already addressed in the report included in the agenda for the Services Delegated Committee on the 12th of July 2021. A summary of the written submissions and the officers' responses to the matters raised were included in the agenda for the Services Delegated Committee meeting held on the 12th of July 21. The key themes arising from the submissions relate to the Council Prayer and Acknowledgement of Country, public question time, the governance framework, and the form and availability of Council and Delegated Committee minutes. Council officers have considered the feedback provided during the public consultation process and have finalised the proposed governance rules. Officers' feedback with regard to those key themes are set out in your business papers. Therefore, the proposed governance rules are presented to Council this evening for consideration and adoption. I commend the officer's recommendation to you as set out in your business papers this evening. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? Councillor Galt.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. Mr. Thompson, just clarifying one point. Under sub-rule 54.2.1, what is the current number of questions that can be asked in any one council session by any one questioner?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Gold, under the current governance rules that we're operating under this particular evening, no individual may ask more than 2 questions at the council meeting.
If I may continue through you, Mayor, I then propose or foreshadow a motion.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. That's duly noted. Councillors, are there any other questions of our governance department? There appears to be no questions. Councillor Galt, you foreshadowed a motion.
Thank you, Mayor. I would like to propose that we adopt the governance rules in the form that they were sent out with the agenda over the agenda paper over the last few days, with one single amendment, that is sub-rule 54.2.1, be moved back from 1 question to 2 questions.
Thank you, Councillor Galt, and I believe officers have prepared that for you, so that motion is now on the screen. Item 1, to adopt the governance rules subject to sub-rule 54.2, reading as no person may submit more than 2 questions at any one council meeting. The governance rules commence on 27 July 2021. Councillor Galt, that appears to be your motion.
Thank you very much. You're happy for me to speak to that?
I'll just search for a seconder if we can drop that off the screen so I can see all councillors. I'm in search of a seconder. Councillor Sinfield, you happy to second that? Sorry. Thank you. I'm not sure whose hand up was first, but I saw yours, Councillor Sinfield. Is to assist Councillor Galt, is there any opposition to this item? There is opposition. I will now move to you as the mover, Councillor Galt, to speak to your motion.
Thank you. I'll just be brief. I believe there's a genuine will in the community to be a little bit more transparent in the way we operate, and also to appear to be. I do recognise that under 54.2.2, we removed the restriction of 11, we will be removing the restriction of 11 questions per year. But then by restricting the questions on any one council meeting back to 1, we effectively re-establish that again. So I think out of right and fairness, to actually move into a more transparent mode, we need to increase that number to 2. I also note that there was some concern that we may take up a lot of council time, but as was pointed out to us recently, the average time over the last year or so taken in public question time was more like a bit over 8 minutes rather than the 15 minutes we've allocated. So I believe it would be a very little impost at the time of the council to increase that from 1 to 2 questions. Thank you. Thank
you, Councillor Galt. Do any other councillors seek to speak to this motion? We have Councillor Franco followed by Councillor Bigger. Councillor Franco.
Thank you. While I support much of what's contained in the governance rules, I'm left with little choice but to vote against the rules as a whole, given the approach that will be adopted by Council, I suspect, in respect of the prayer and in respect of measures to promote greater transparency, openness and community engagement, which I consider to be a fundamental basis of good governance. I do welcome Councillor Galt's motion in respect of lifting the limit on the number of questions as he proposed. In respect of the prayer, our community has spoken loudly and clearly. An overwhelming number of the submissions have addressed the issue. Many of these submissions are thoughtful and deeply considered. In addition, today we received a submission with over 1,000 signatories asking us to end this practice. And I want to acknowledge some of the key points that have been raised by some who did make submissions. Firstly, it's been made abundantly clear to us that our community does have diverse religious and non-religious beliefs, and that the council prayer, which I'm informed at least is an adaptation of the prayer found in the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, does not reflect this diversity. At the 2016 census, over 37% of Boroondara residents identified as having no religion, significantly higher than the 30% of the national average at the time. And it's likely that the 2021 census, which we're about to enter, will show a much higher figure still. And in a society like ours that respects religious freedom and freedom from religion, in a society like ours that does respect freedom of religion and freedom from religion, there is no objection to an individual privately seeking their God's blessings to assist them in their work. But our prayer is not a private reflection for the benefit of councillors, as has been stated by officers in some reports. It's a public demonstration of faith. And because each and every council meeting begins with this Christian prayer, our council is giving the impression that people who don't have religious beliefs or who hold different religious beliefs don't fit in. As one resident submitted, I want to quote this because I think it sums it up quite well. I quote, "At the start of each meeting, council is effectively saying, this council is made up of people who believe in our God, and we will use that belief to guide our decision making. If you don't believe in our God, then we don't really care about that. You are not one of us, and we will govern you for the advancement of our God's glory, whether you share these values or not." End of quote. And the veracity of this is equally underscored by many of those who made submissions in support of retaining the prayer. Many of whom noted its importance in reflecting and reinforcing Boroondara's Christian heritage and outlook. I think these submissions in support of the prayer are genuine and heartfelt, and they're consistent with the reasons prayer was introduced into local government in the first place. But we've seen that the makeup of our community has changed, and it's not and to retain the prayer is not consistent with our practice and policies and principles, in particular by our embracing of inclusivity. The suggestion, and it was made by our Chief Executive last week, that those who don't wish to participate in the prayer are free to leave the room or to not participate, isn't what we really mean by inclusivity. We have to publicly champion our claim of inclusivity and really embrace it. If it's something we're serious about, this is not a way of doing it. Secondly, it's inconsistent with the principles of secularism, and it's the hallmark of Australian democracy, and our practice is blurring this line. And finally, I want to touch on the question of legality. It's been noted that there's a serious question about whether having an official prayer is even lawful. And yet this has been set aside and no legal advice on this issue has been sought. So I think with that, I'll leave it there, and I'll be voting against the motion before us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Do any other councillors seek to speak to this item? Councillor Bigger.
Yep, thank you, Mayor. So I fully support the direction of travel. I think of the proposed changes to the public question time. So obviously there's a lot in this entire motion tonight, and I do believe that the changes that we're making, which may be small, but are improving our transparency. I think by not placing undue restrictions regarding questions and ensuring that we're not placing barriers in the way of people being able to participate. I think it's fundamentally important that we remain committed to open dialogue with our community, and public question time is an important part of that. So I would certainly support Councillor Galt's amendment maintaining the number of questions at 2 per meeting. But probably the fundamental issue really, or certainly one of the issue that we had the biggest feedback on over our governance rules really was prayer. And when I reflect on what I've read and what I've heard, I believe that the overwhelming mood of the feedback we received was that religion has a place in society. And for many of us, a very important place, but that place is not in a government meeting. It's not in local government. And that while prayer is undoubtedly important to many in our community, I think our community is clearly one which is diverse, it's multicultural, it's a community where and we as a council are meant to represent our community, both people of all faiths and no faiths. And given that, I think a Christian prayer is probably not representative. I don't need to repeat, I think, what Councillor Franco has already said. I guess the only addition I would say is that I think that if the interpretation of this is that it's something that is really just for us as councillors, I continue to think that we might have then a prayer or a moment of silence, whatever each of us as councillors find helpful before our meetings, but before that meeting was public. Otherwise, I think what we do in our public meeting is fundamentally in the public domain, and it needs to represent our community. A moment of silence, an oath, a pledge for good governance might do that. I don't think that a Christian prayer does that. And from what I've heard and read on the community, I am convinced that that the inclusion of a prayer at the beginning of council meeting is not inclusive, fully inclusive of our diverse and multi-faith community. And so as a result, I will have to vote against this motion. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Bigger. Councillor Hollingsworth, you're happy to speak to this as well?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I want to talk in support of the governance rules motion. And sorry, are you having trouble hearing?
Your voice is a little bit soft, Councillor Hollingsworth.
I am using a device that's very foreign to me, and I don't know how to turn the volume up on it. So sorry about that. Look, with regard to supporting the governance rules, the message that I want to convey is that on the 12th of July this year, I attended a multi-faith Boroondara Reconciliation Network prayer for reconciliation, which was a very humble, kind, considerate, put together service that recognised respect for our Aboriginal elders and Aboriginal community. It was in tribute to reconciliation. It was done at the end of NAIDOC week, and there were many Aboriginal members of our community there, as there was many other leaders of various faith groups across Boroondara. And with all of the multi-faith organisations, the word of, whether it be God or in the Indigenous word, Bunjil, representing the Kulin Nation word for the creator, the deity, the ancestral being. Every denomination that was there, or those that were just people that had belief or faith that were not particularly affiliated with denomination, acknowledged that it was a wonderful day of bringing the community together. It was respecting our Indigenous community, but it was also recognising our Australian heritage from those that migrated to the country and respect of our elders. So look, I personally think that the governance rules that we have, inclusive of the prayer, but equally inclusive of the acknowledgement of the country, respects everyone within our community. No one is excluded. And the prayer is not about any particular denomination. Reference to God is reference to all communities, and I'm very much in support of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Are there any further councillors seeking to speak to this motion? Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm a bit frustrated with this debate because this should be about our governance rules more broadly, and it's been centred around one thing, and that's the council prayer. Governance for our community and how it's administered to ensure democracy and fair process. How many public questions is reasonable? And I welcome the change put by Councillor Gold. What's fair and reasonable as far as time for speakers and preambles to questions? What's reasonable to allow a democratic open door policy here for our community whilst being reasonable about time? And how do we achieve the right balance? But instead we've been distracted and our reputation diminished because sadly the recent debate about prayer has embarrassed me and it's dragged us down, I feel. The practice of prayer in government has been part of our Judeo-Christian heritage dating back to Federation for all meetings of all governing bodies. Federal Parliament still retains its opening prayer. In fact, they have two. Their prayer, which bears a very strong resemblance to ours, and the Lord's Prayer. The Constitution opens with similar words, but for me, it allows a much needed pause for reflection. In our overly busy world, it sets the tone for the important and often highly charged discussions that follow. It allows us to be present in the moment and reflect on a higher power, or if no such belief, the common good for our community. Our role here is one of civic leadership, not as individuals, but as a group of 11. And it's a pertinent and timely reminder that we're here in this chamber, elected to make the best decisions that we can in the interests of our community, absent personal biases, personal drivers and personal ambition. I sought advice from a local reverend in the lead up to this discussion, and the notion that it's Christian prayer, I'm reliably informed that it is not. Further, that Christianity, Islam and Judaism all follow Abraham and they have a common foundation and all believe in the same God. Since the 1st century, the Bible has summarised Christian values as joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control and all sorts of words. And I'm not quite sure what's so egregious about that. I would hope that they're values that we all share. Our prayer is broad, respectful, dignified and not exclusive, in my opinion. I'd like to draw your attention to the varied groups within our community whose goodwill and community mindedness is based upon religious values and beliefs. Many volunteer organisations, including St Vincent's, known as the Vinnie's charity shops across Boroondara, and alike St John's Ambulance, the Salvation Army, Hope Food Drive by St Hilary's Church in my ward, Brotherhood of St Lawrence, Anglicare, Sacred Heart Mission and all sorts of other local charities, are all based upon these common values. And volunteerism in Boroondara is among the highest in Australia. Much of it's affiliated or founded by various organisations I've just mentioned. 26% of the Boroondara population volunteers, compared with 17% of the general population in Greater Melbourne, which is a substantial difference. And volunteering plays a critical role in supporting our community by assisting in the delivery of important services and programs, as well as playing an important and vital role in our economy, because if our volunteers didn't provide those services, then we'd probably have to fund them. So they play a huge value in what we do. I was also interested to observe at the most recent citizenship ceremony on the 15th of July, just last week, that out of the 38 candidates who were bestowed citizenship, 66% of them, 25 out of the 38, took the oath, and 32%, or 12 out of the 38, chose to affirm their loyalty. And I think that's telling of our newest Australians. And also in a Herald Sun poll, which I'm sure you've all had a look at, over 1,200 responses received in that one, the result was even clearer. 86% of respondents said that we should keep the prayer and 14% said no. What's next? Christmas and Easter? I certainly will be supporting the motion that has been put by Councillor Gold, and I was pleased to second it. I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Any further councillors seeking to speak to this item before I move back to the mover to close out the debate? Any other councillors? Appears to be none. Councillor Galt, are you happy to round out the debate on your item, your motion?
Thank you, Mayor. I don't wish to add anything more to the comments I made earlier, but to commend the motion to Council.
And on that note, councillors, I'll now put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? Those against? I declare that motion carried. Thank you, councillors. Councillor Franco?
I'd like to call a division. Thanks.
Thank you, councillors. A division's been called, and therefore I'll need to seek the vote again, and I'll call out your names for the record. So all those in favour, and I'll call out your names. If you can keep your hands up in the air. That's Councillor Galt, Councillor Sinfield, Councillor Watson, Councillor Gillies, Councillor Addis, Councillor Park, Councillor Hollingsworth, Councillor Stavrou, and myself, Councillor Thompson, and those against. That's Councillor Biggar and Councillor Franco. I declare the motion carried. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item 7.7 of our agenda papers, adoption of the terms of reference for advisory groups. This will be introduced by Mr. David Shepherd, Manager of Environmental Sustainability and Open Spaces.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor, the purpose of this report is for Council to adopt the terms of reference for 3 advisory committees. These committees are the Early Years Advisory Committee, the Waste Management Reference Group, and the Canterbury Project Steering Committee. These 3 committees have met this year and made minor changes to their previous terms of reference. The terms of reference set out how these committees will operate and in the business papers tonight. The Canterbury Committee has also changed its name to reflect a broader approach and ensure coverage of the Mailing Road Place Plan. The officer recommendation has been revised slightly tonight, and it is to adopt each of the terms of reference as provided in the attachments to the report, with a slight amendment to part 3 of the recommendation so that the name for the Canterbury Group reads as the Canterbury Project Steering Committee. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherd. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr. Shepherd on this item? There appears to be none. I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Watson?
Happy to move the motion as printed.
The motion with the amended officer's recommendation?
Yes, the amended motion. Thank you.
Thank you. And seconded, Councillor Hollingsworth? I think that was a yes. And to assist Councillor Watson, is there any opposition on this item? I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item 7.8, the Kew Recreation Centre, Contamination and Consultancy Variation. This will be introduced by Ms. Christine White, Manager of Capital Projects.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, the purpose of this report is to seek variation approval to 2 existing and separate contracts to meet procurement guidelines. The Kew Recreation Centre is located on a site of approximately 1.5 hectares that is currently under construction to build the new Community Recreation Centre. Prior to tender, Council engaged an environmental consultant, Consultancy, to undertake a detailed soil contamination management plan. As a result of this plan, a significant provisional sum was included within the contract, with the management intent to keep as much of the highest level of contamination on site. A copy of the Consultancy report is attached to the Council report for all to view, and that shows the detailed investigations undertaken to understand the site soil contamination issues. The report, however, did not highlight the presence of an old diesel tank and the extent of volatile soils as a result of the diesel-infused soils, a legacy of the former Kew depot. It should be noted that the previous recreation centre was in operation at the time of the Consultancy investigations. limiting the testing that could be undertaken within the building. For example, testing through an existing pool structure was not possible. And as it happened, the diesel tank was located beneath the spar of the previous centre that the Subversa investigation did not identify. To date, almost 14,000 tonnes have been removed from site to meet EPA regulations, including removal of diesel-infused soils and other contaminated soils geotechnically unsuitable for reuse. To undertake this removal in accordance with the regulations, an additional $3.55 million of funding is required. Whilst contract variations to manage contaminations totals $4.55 million, project offsets of approximately $1 million can be realised through value management and commercial negotiations. The second part of this report seeks variation approval to contract 2018-177 for architectural consultancy services. The tender award was originally based on $53 million of building works, and this sum was increased and approved in council budgets to $67.5 million that also reflected an increase in project scope, such as a creche area, party room, and increase to car bays. Consequently, a variation claim from William Ross Architects was submitted based on increased scope and budget. In accordance with procurement guidelines, this variation requires council approval. The total variation is for the sum of $464,201, which covers the provisional sum allowance for contingencies and the potential prolongation of services. Any savings realised at the completion of the works will be identified as a credit in the financial year 2022-23. In summary, the officer recommendation is to authorise the Director of Places and Spaces to approve the variations of the two contracts.
Thank you, Ms White, for your presentation. Councillors, are there any questions of Ms White this evening? Councillor Stavrey.
No questions, Mr Mayor, but I foreshadow a motion when it's appropriate.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrey. Any other questions from councillors? There appears to be none. Councillor Stavrey, your motion.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Through you, I would like to move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrey. And I've got a second to Councillor Park.
Yes, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Park. To assist Councillor Stavrey, is there any opposition on this item? There appears to be none. Councillor Stavrey, do you wish to speak to your motion?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Let me first thank the officers for a very thorough report. Let me also direct your attention to the attachment of the report, where very transparent, if blow-by-blow account of the due diligence performed to minimise the sort of risk which is the subject of this paper. Unfortunately, risk might be well minimised, but it cannot totally eliminate it in these circumstances. The tyranny of the extremely low probability events will be ever present in any worthwhile endeavour. Page 8 of the attachment certainly discusses in very succinct terminology the elimination of uncertainty. Some uncertainty is inherent in all site investigations. Furthermore, any sample, either surface or subsurface, taken for chemical testing may or may not be representative of the large population area. And as we saw in that report, there have been many areas, boreholes that were made to ensure that great due diligence was performed. More importantly, though, is how we react and address these unknown unknowns that becomes the real test of our management. I'm convinced that the officers have sought to minimise both cost and disruption to this marvellous project that provide enormous joy to our community for a very long time. They did this with good old multiple stakeholder management, know-how, and cooperation by working with the developer to achieve a good outcome. Now, let me highlight that throughout this process, Council ensured that the people neighbouring the construction site have been informed and appropriately cared and attention given to them. Having worked with them on some delicate cases around the site, I commend the officers' consummate professionalism. And without further ado, I ask my fellow councillors to support the officer recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrey. And as there was no opposition, I will now put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors and also officers. We'll move on to item 7.9, advanced waste processing. This will be introduced again by Mr. David Shepherd, Manager of Environmental Sustainability and Open Places.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. The purpose of this report is to provide information on the South Eastern Metropolitan Advanced Waste Processing Project being led by the Metropolitan Waste and Resource Recovery Group, and specifically the establishment of a special purpose vehicle so that Council can make a decision on further participation in the project. Boroondara has been participating in the project along with 15 other councils in the region. The project aims to address the issue of landfill capacity by providing an alternative with improved environmental, social and economic outcomes. The collaborative procurement process has identified 3 potential providers through an expression of interest process. The next phase includes the establishment of a special purpose vehicle, which will deliver and manage a relationship with the provider once the site is established. A financial contribution is required from all participating councils to assist in the establishment of the special purpose vehicle and the site selection. Continued participation keeps council's options open for future decisions for waste management. This is a continuously changing industry and it's not known exactly what other options for advanced waste will be. The officer recommendation is to participate in the establishment of the special purpose vehicle and to make the required financial contribution up to the value of $75,000. The recommendation is also to present a further report to Council after the completion of the tender process so that Council can consider its position again at that point in time. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherd. Councillors, are there any questions of officers on this item? Appears, sorry, the questions? Yes, Councillor Colt, followed by Councillor Bigger.
Thank you, Mayor. I suspect there's no real alternative because we have to find a solution for our waste. And the holes in the ground will disappear fairly quickly. And there's probably, as we know, all sorts of methane problems with simply waste filling those holes. And I will welcome the results that come back from the study we're about to enter into and put a hand out to industry to see what's available. But I'd be very keen as part of that study, and I'm sure you will do this, that we will look at the emissions from landfill compared to the emissions that results from the various proposals that come forward as part of this study. I just really post that as a note rather than a question, but if there is an answer to it at this point in time, I'd be happy to have that.
Mr. Shepherd, taking on that on notice, or Mr. Freer, I think, has got his hands up.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, that certainly is a part of the tender evaluation process for each of the bids that the special purpose vehicle will work through, is to undertake that environmental analysis, and we will also do that in comparison to landfill and the methane and leachate emissions that come from landfill to provide that comparative analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Freer. I'll note you've got a question to Councillor Watson. Before I come to you, I'll go to Councillor Bigger, who I think also had a question.
Yeah, it's just a simple one that might be in the report, and thank you for this report. But just the timing, how long is it anticipated that this study will take, and when do you anticipate coming back to us then with the full report? Mr. Freer.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. We anticipate the tender process to continue on throughout the course of this year. They're quite significant propositions that are being put forward by the 3 tenderers at this point in time, and we would expect towards the end of this year or perhaps early in 2022 that we would have that analysis back to Council.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bigger. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Question for officers. The landfill levy that we as council and all councils pay goes into something called a sustainability fund. And as I recall, this sustainability fund was put together primarily to provide a bucket of money that was going to be able to fund these sorts of projects, alternative ways to dispose of our waste, which are environmentally friendly and essentially not landfill. Is not the request for us to spend $75,000 on this project double dipping? Why does our contribution, or why does the Sustainability Fund not cover this? Would you be able to answer that question?
Okay, Mr. Freer again.
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. You're quite right, Councillor Watson. The Sustainability Fund was established to provide funding support for a range of initiatives to deal with waste management and other environmental issues and initiatives associated with waste management. And that includes the funding of groups like the Metropolitan Waste and Resource Recovery Group and Sustainability Victoria and others. The legislation in which the Metropolitan Waste and Resource Recovery Group was established under does not allow that group to hold a position, I guess, like a special purpose vehicle and to call tenders on its own. It needs to do that through a council or through a special purpose vehicle. And the contribution that is being sought here is to effectively capitalise the special purpose vehicle to make it an entity that is a going concern and can commence that process and refine the tenders down to a point to be able to award that. So unfortunately, the legislation as it is at the moment does not allow the Metropolitan Waste and Resource Recovery Group to do that alone and requires the contribution of each council to establish the special purpose vehicle.
Thank you, Mr. Freer. That answers your question, Councillor Watson.
Yep.
So, are there any further questions from councillors? Otherwise, I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Watson.
Happy to move the motion as printed, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. And seconded, Councillor Bigger. Thank you. To assist Councillor Watson, is there any opposition on this item? There isn't. Councillor Watson, do you wish to speak to your motion?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I'll leave it apart from saying thank you to the officers for the exceptional work brought to us here tonight and for the understanding that we've all received through reading it. So I commend the motion to my fellow councillors.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I'll now put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item... So we'll move on to 8, general business. Are there any items of general business? Councillor Galt.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess the lockdown has been trying on us all, but I have found it a great excuse to spend some time walking around the electorate and the ward, and I'm amazed with what I bump into sometimes. And I did have the great joy of having a look at the Yarra Bend Reserve, the new playground that is due to be open shortly, and I'd have to say the fences are down, and someone very close to me tried the slide. But I'd love to commend it because it is not like any other playground. There's the most wonderful sculpture in there by, I believe, Benjamin Gilbert. That's like an upturned racing skiff and some wonderful other sculptures around. It's more like a playground for adults and children, I'd have to say. So, and I understand that Rotary were party to funding it, to partly fund it, and I commend that. And I understand there will be an official opening on Sunday, the 8th at 12:45. So I'd like to commend, at the risk of looking like a culture vulture, you all to attend that or to at least have a look at this wonderful sculptural playground. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Galton. Yes, it's going to be an exciting opening, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of interested kids partaking in that slide as amongst a few adults, it sounds like to me. Thank you for that. Any further items of general business this evening? There appears to be none. Item 9, urgent business. Are there any items of urgent business? Councillor Addis.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillors, I have a proposed motion of censure regarding recent behaviours of Councillor Franco that I would like to be admitted as an item of urgent business. And I believe there's something that's going to go up on the screen.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. Can I confirm from governance that something is to go up on the screen? Councillor Addis, do you wish to speak to this?
That's the motion that I'd like to move.
So the motion resolves to admit an item of urgent business as a proposed censure motion concerning Councillor Victor Franco because of this item relates to or arises out of a matter which has arisen since the distribution of the agenda and cannot safely or conveniently be deferred until the next council meeting. That is your motion, Councillor Addis?
That is, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Can governance please put the motion to have this item admitted as urgent business as what we've just seen on the screen? Can I'm in search of a seconder for Councillor Addis. Councillor Gillies. Thank you. To assist Councillor Addis, is there any opposition on this item? There appears to be opposition.
I'm not sure what the item is about, so I can't clearly identify whether I'm in favour or in support.
Okay, so this motion here is simply to admit the item for urgent business. So if it's admitted, then the item will be discovered in urgent business. So, Councillor Addis, do you wish to put your motion to the vote?
Yes. Look, if it's not opposed, I believe I don't need to speak to it. I'm happy for it just to be put to the vote and then move on to the actual motion.
I'll put that motion. Councillor Bigger, did you foreshadow that you were in opposition?
I suppose I was going to say a similar thing to Councillor Franco, that it's very difficult for me to vote on something when I don't know what it means. But if the vote is to have the discussion, it sounds like I'll accept that.
That's correct. So on that basis, I'll now put the motion to admit the item of urgent business. All those in favour? Those against? So that's 8, 9 in favour and 2 not voting. So that motion's carried. So I'll now move to the item of urgent business. Councillor Addis, do you wish to move your motion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I circulated a motion to officers earlier, and I wonder if that could please be put up on the screen. And then it's quite a long motion, so I believe I might need to read it out to give us all time to absorb it.
Thank you. It's up on the screen, Councillor Addis.
Yes, so that is my motion. It's a little bit longer, but if we could scroll it as I read it out. So the motion is that this council, 1, censure Councillor Franco for A, failing to work together with other councillors in the best interests of the people within our municipal community. B, bringing discredit upon council. C, misusing his position to cause or attempt to cause detriment to council or another person. D, failing to acknowledge and support the role of the mayor. E, expressing personal opinions in the media in a way that the comments were derogatory, offensive and insulting of council and councillors. And F, failing to act in accordance with the Councillor Code of Conduct, to which Councillor Franco signed his name after being sworn in as a councillor. The motion notes that without traversing seriatim, the conduct of Councillor Franco, upon which the censure is based, it includes, most recently, seeking out an interview with Radio 3AW about 3:45 p.m. on 14 July 2021, and during that broadcast, stating words to the effect, we might need to scroll a little bit at this stage.
I think, Councillor Addis, you can actually scroll on your screen.
Oh, so it is scrolled up, thank you. Well, I think it's basically called hypocrisy. In response to the interviewer asking, you are on record as saying you support the declaration of a climate emergency, correct? Then why is the same council opposed to turning a car park into a green space? The question related to the decision on 12 July 2021 by the Services Delegated Committee of Council regarding matter 3.1 Camberwell Green. Councillor Franco started the campaign to alter the use of the subject car park to green space for use by Camberwell Primary School, where his 2 children are students. The councillor refused to declare a conflict of interest, yet absented himself during deliberations by the committee. The word scandalously used by the councillor to describe the conduct of council and other councillors rested upon the false premise that council had expressed support for the declaration of a climate emergency. That question was determined by council on 25 May 2020. Only 3 councillors voted in the affirmative. 3 councillors does not constitute a majority. B, you get this special permit you affix to the windscreen of your car. Isn't this good? And where it says 2P parking, you can park all day and you don't get fined. So we, as council, we create and establish a parking restrictions. We enforce them, but when it comes to applying them to ourselves, it's quite a different story, isn't it? In reference to the parking of vehicles by councillors, that characterisation entirely misrepresents the effective clause 15.4 of the councillor and member of a delegated committee, its expenses policy 2020, available on council's website, which 1, requires that to park beyond the applicable period, the councillor must be engaged on council business or performing the functions of a councillor. 2, makes clear that councillors are subject to the road safety rules and any relevant council policy, and that the permits do not allow councillors to park in red sign or designated areas. C, at the moment, we've released a draft climate action plan and put that out for public comment. I think it contains some deficiencies and doesn't really contain any concrete actions. It's more of a brochure in terms of targets and niceties, but without any of the substance behind it in terms of whatever funding will go into concrete actions. The comments by Councillor Franco in describing the detailed draft action plan as a brochure are demeaning of the work done by council officers consequent upon some 1,567 public responses and of the work done by other councillors. It demonstrates further a failure by Councillor Franco to work together with other councillors in the best interests of our community and tends to preempt and prejudice the council decision by making public comment prematurely. And thank you, everyone. That's my motion that I'm seeking to put.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. We might just drop that from the screen just so I can see all councillors. Councillor Addis, that's your motion that you're putting forward. Yes. Is there a seconder to that motion? Councillor Stavrou, thank you. Is there opposition to that motion? There appears to be opposition to that motion. I will return to you as the mover of that motion, Councillor Addis.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, if I could just start by saying I genuinely prefer not to be moving this motion, but I'm in a position where I can see no alternative as a means to correct the public record. So the motion before us puts on public record concerns about a colleague's behaviour, and it corrects comments made by Councillor Franco in the 3AW interview of 14th of July 2021. So here's the problem. A councillor has approached the mainstream media to voice a personal view on a matter of council business, and the comments made by Councillor Franco contain a number of factual errors, as have been outlined in this censure motion. In my view, there is a need to publicly express concern about Councillor Franco's actions and to correct some of Councillor Franco's comments. The point of this censure motion is that it allows us to do just that, but at the same time we're following our code of conduct and media policy, which actually don't allow councillors to engage with the media as such, for us to also go to the media to set the record straight. So I'm suggesting this method because it's important that we respect the conventions that we govern ourselves by. This censure motion is the appropriate avenue for us to respond publicly, to voice our concerns about Councillor Franco's behaviour, and to remind him that while there is a place for robust debate, the place for this to occur is within the council chamber. It's not a debate when one councillor goes to the mainstream media. This motion also allows us to correct errors contained in the comments made by Councillor Franco during the interview. So in essence, it's about calling out bad behaviour and correcting the public record. And I argue to not support this motion could imply approval of the comments made by Councillor Franco. And thank you. I'll end it there for the moment. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. Do any other councillors seek to speak on this item? Councillor Bigger, and then followed by Councillor Franco.
Yeah, look, I do need to speak to this, though. You know, I don't have it on the screen in front of me, and having not seen it before, it's obviously very long, and there's a lot to say. But I guess I would say that that it feels like a very big action, and maybe to me the wrong action to deal with this matter. And I think it's not completely fair to say that to not support this means to fully be endorsing all of the statements that Councillor Franco made on air, because there's a lot incorporated in this statement, including things like to say that Councillor Franco is failing to work together with other councillors, and I think that's quite a broad statement, and I don't think it's representative of the last 8 months. I think we're talking about an incident that people have concerns about. I think to say we're trying to bring discredit to council is a strong statement. So while I wouldn't say that all of the comments that were made by Councillor Franco were comments that I would have said, or that I would even fully support, or that even the way of going about that is probably not the way that I personally would have done it. But at the same time, I don't think this is an appropriate avenue for addressing all of those things. I think that when I think about what the community wants us to be doing, I think they want us to be working in their interest and working together in their interests. And so while I think that that there are things we need to work out about the way we do that in public, particularly in the media, I'm not convinced that this censure is the way that I I can support, and with no other, notice of it, or having not read it before now, it's not possible for me to believe that this is the way we want to be addressing our frustrations or our dissatisfactions with one another over the next 3.5 years. I cannot see that as conducive to A, the way we want to work together, and B, the way I believe the community wants us to work together. So I will have to oppose this.
Thank you, Councillor Biggar. Councillor Franco.
Thank you. Well, this has taken me by surprise, and the length of the motion is such that it's a bit difficult to respond to all the issues that it addresses and that it contains. So, look, I just want to touch on a few points that have been raised by this motion, but I may not be addressing everything that's raised. Again, this is very lengthy. There's a lot here. There's a lot to digest, but I'll make the following points. Firstly, there is nothing improper with an elected councillor giving media interviews about motions that are debated at council meetings. This is just ordinary democracy and free speech. And I don't consider that our code of conduct could possibly be read as prohibiting this kind of thing. And I hope I am not misquoting Councillor Addis. It's not my intention, but the statement that our media policy does not allow councillors to approach or speak to the media, presumably without approval, and that the place for robust debate is only in the council chamber. So I find that surprising. I mean, secondly, make the point that the Local Government Act says that and I've looked it up very quickly while I was listening. Section 139, quote, a councillor code of conduct is inoperative to the extent that it's inconsistent with any act, including the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act 2006. And the Charter protects the right to freedom of expression, and banning councillors from giving media interviews about motions debated at council meetings is seemingly inconsistent with this right. And the Charter of Human Rights also makes it unlawful for councils to act in a way that's incompatible with any charter right. So attempting to prevent a councillor from giving media interviews or attempting to take and in this case, attempting to take adverse action against a councillor for giving media interviews is questionable. Third, another point I want to make is public debate and discussion of matters that come before council is a hallmark of modern, open, inclusive and democratic council. And my wish is that this council focus on debating the issues that matter to our community rather than to make debates personal about me. I think it has, and going to this issue, it's come up because there are two very contentious issues. In this case, it's Camberwell Green and the issue of restoring the green parkland in Camberwell that has given rise to it, and separately concerns been raised about media comments that I've given in relation to prayer and council's position on prayer, and that's been very contentious to some of my colleagues. And look, I really want to make the point, my comments and never been intended to be anything other than robust public debate in a democracy. And that's really what it's about. And if it's not my intention to speak in a derogatory manner, I don't consider that I did. And if that's certainly not my intention. So look, I'll leave it there. There were also all sorts of comments made about purported inaccuracies, and in my comments, I'd have to review that. I mean, there's not much time for me to respond to those here in any clear or meaningful way, given the length of the motion and the surprise nature of it. Thank you. I'll be abstaining from the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Franco, and duly noted. I have Councillor Stavrey followed by Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And just hearing the words of Councillor Franco there about human rights and other aspects. I mean, the key thing, though, is not to make certain statements that are derogatory or hurtful. And I certainly don't think being called a hypocrite is a good thing. I certainly took that personally as being called a hypocrite. And I can assure you I take absolute no pleasure having to do this and to be talking about one of our own, particularly at a time when many of our fellow residents are doing it tough. Some in New South Wales are doing it even tougher. This is not something that I certainly imagined in the slightest when I decided to run for council office, and even less so when I met my fellow councillors, including Councillor Franco. I'm sure that I'm reflecting what my fellow councillors are feeling. I echo Councillor Addis's words and urge Councillor Franco to seriously consider the seriousness of the words as advice, if he wills. Reach for the olive branch. Take on board seriously the firm words of the censure statement. I recommend that Councillor Franco uses this as an opportunity to reboot, to help find a way to put this behind us so that we can all grow into a great council over the remainder of our term and serve the people of Boroondara. I think that's the key thing. And I'll leave it at that, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrou. Councillor Park.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I want to firstly agree with some of the comments made by Councillor Biggar. Councillor Biggar indicated that, in her view, the community expects that councillors will work together in their interests. And that's clearly true. And to my observation, over the 9 years that I've been on council, my experience has been that councillors, generally speaking, have done that and done that well. Councillor Biggar suggested that this was a very big action and a strong statement. Yes, it absolutely is. It's actually unprecedented in the city of Boroondara. Never before has a censure motion been moved against a sitting councillor. But where I disagree with Councillor Biggar is that this isn't about addressing frustrations with one another. And that's a really poor characterisation of what this is. This is about addressing really appalling conduct by one of our number. And Councillor Franco talks about the right to free speech. Well, he has that right, but he has some obligations, not only to his colleagues and to the city generally and to the 185,000 residents whom he represents. He's got a responsibility to tell the truth when he goes on air and gives media interviews. And quite frankly, to suggest that councillors are somehow rorting the system through parking permits is outrageous. It's untrue and outrageous. Scandalous, quite well put in the motion, actually goes some way to underscore just how egregious that conduct was. To talk about hypocrisy by councillors, again, there was no basis for that. It was an appalling slur. The councillors who put their hand up to represent the community and give of their time have good reputations, and they value those reputations. They don't come here to have those reputations tarnished or besmirched with cheap headline-grabbing interviews. So I support the motion without qualification.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Do any other councillors seek to speak to this motion? Appears to be none. I'll move back to the mover of the motion, Councillor Addis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to my colleagues for their comments. I do want to emphasise that this is simply about holding us all to good behaviour. That's genuinely what this is about. And I guess could I also remind Councillor Franco that he did actually sign the Code of Conduct. So I think signing something means we're basically bound by it. I certainly feel bound by it and am as careful as I can in my behaviour to not breach what the Code of Conduct and, for that matter, the media policy directs me to behave in a certain way. And I think that this motion is in the best interests of our community, which, yes, we represent. Boroondara has always had a really high satisfaction from our community, and we do pride ourselves on focusing on our community. And I think the really important thing is that we do that within the council chamber, where proper debate is actually possible. Measured, thoughtful, proper debate is possible in the council chamber, where we can all hear each other, think about it, come to different opinions, and then vote on something. And that is what proper debate is. And that sort of behaviour does require us all to be disciplined in our behaviour, both within the council chamber and outside it. So look, on that basis, I'd like to commend this motion to my colleagues.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. I'll now put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? Those against? Those abstaining? I declare the motion passed. Councillor Park.
I'd like to seek a division, as is the trend tonight. Thank you.
A division's been called, so I need to ask for that vote to be put again. So I'll put that motion again. All those in favour, and I'll keep your hands up and I'll call your names out. So that is Councillor Addis, Councillor Sinfield, Councillor Watson, Councillor Gillies, Councillor Hollingsworth, Councillor Park, Councillor Stavrou, Councillor Galt, and myself, Councillor Thompson. Those against? Councillor Bigger. Those abstaining? Councillor Franco. Thank you.
Comment?
Yeah.
Just, I wonder whether I have a conflict of interest in relation to this motion. It's about me and whether I should have participated. So I don't know what the governance rules are there, and I'll take it as part of my reason for abstaining. But please understand that I'm just caught on the run, and I don't know what the governance rules say in respect of that.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. That's duly noted. Councillors, will move on to the rest of our business papers. Are there any further items of urgent business this evening? There appears to be none. We'll move on to item 10, confidential business. There is a matter of confidential business this evening. So councillors, which is 10.1, Audit and Risk Committee, appointment of chairperson. Councillors, I'm in search of a colleague to move the following motion, and the motion reads, 1, that in accordance with section 66-1, 66-2A of the Local Government Act 2020, the meeting be closed to members of the public for the consideration of an agenda item titled the Audit and Risk Committee, appointment of chairperson. This agenda item is confidential information for the purposes of section 3-1 of the Local Government Act 2020. A, because it contains personal information, being information which, if released, would result in unreasonable disclosure of information about any person or other personal affairs, section 3-1F, and also B. This ground applies because the agenda item concerns personal and contractual matter, and the premature disclosure of the personal information would be prejudicial to the interests of the other person and council. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Park, and seconded, I think, Councillor Biggie, you just snuck in before Councillor Stavrou. I'll now put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. So I'll declare the council meeting closed to the public. To members of the community watching tonight's proceedings, the live stream will cease while confidential business is being discussed. We'll reopen the meeting to the public at the conclusion of the discussion. Thank you, everyone.